In September, Grant and the 4th departed for Corpus Christi, now in Texas, to board the transport ship Sevilla. Upon arriving, Grant fell overboard in high swells while transferring between the Sevilla and a smaller transport steamer. Grant was not hurt, and the smaller transport steamer continued on, but had to be literally dragged through the shallow channel the 16 miles to Corpus Christi. There, the 3,000 men, under the command of Brevet Brigadier General Zachary Taylor, assembled along the new border. Grant wrote, "We were sent to provoke a fight with Mexico, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. Once initiated, there were but few public men who would have the courage to oppose it." In November, Grant was promoted to full second lieutenant. Taylor then advanced his army the 150 miles to the Rio Grande across from Matamoros. Matamoros was the largest Mexican population in the area, and Taylor was now in disputed territory just short of actually invading Mexico proper. By April 24, 1846, Mexican General Mariano Arista had 5,000 troops amassed at Matamoros and crossed the Rio Grande. Several skirmishes occurred during the next several days in which 2 American scouting parties were captured by the larger Mexican forces. On May 3rd, the Mexican troops began to besiege the hastily fortified American Fort Texas, also known as Fort Brown. Taylor moved his forces south to relieve the siege, and Arista moved his forces to meet him. The 2 armies met and on May 8th engaged in the Battle of Palo Alto. Grant wrote that the Mexican artillery opened up upon them, but their shots fell short. As the Americans advanced further, the Mexican cannonballs struck in front of them, but were so slowed by the impact and the tall, dense grass that the men merely stepped aside and let the balls roll by. The American artillery, however, was much more effective. Its mobility, range, and variety of shot turned the battle for the Americans. Grant also wrote of the intensity of battle. "There was a brisk fire upon our troops. One cannonball took off the head of an enlisted man, while the splinters of the musket of the killed soldier and his brains and bones knocked down 2 or 3 others." The battle paused that night. The next day, the Mexicans moved south with the Americans following. By 3 p.m., the Battle of Resaca de la Palma was underway. Grant led his company on a charge and captured a number of Mexican soldiers and a wounded colonel. Grant received recognition for his leadership in action, but, as he wrote, "The ground had been charged over before. My exploit was equal to that of a soldier who boasted that he had cut off the leg of one of the enemy. When asked why he had not cut off his head, he replied, 'Someone had done that before.'" News of the actions and battles got back to Washington, D.C., and on May 13th, the U.S. Congress declared war on Mexico. New volunteer troops began to arrive, including Ohio Congressman Hammer, who had given Grant his appointment at West Point. By August 19th, the Army started for Monterrey, Mexico. Grant was placed in charge of the wagons for his 4th Infantry. Pack mules were hired along with local Mexicans to pack and drive them. Grant wrote that the mules were often stubborn and obstinate. "I am not aware of ever having used a profane expletive in my life, but I would have the charity to excuse those who may have done so, if they were in charge of a train of Mexican pack mules at the time." By September 19th, the U.S. Army was encamped within 3 miles of Monterrey. Mexican General Pedro de Ampudia, commanding a force of at least 7,000 men, was entrenched in and around the city. Grant wrote that Taylor's U.S. Army was just over 6,000 men. The battle that ensued was hard fought with heavy losses on both sides. By the end of the first day, September 21st, the Americans had taken over several Mexican positions and forts. Grant's 4th Infantry was sent into the battle, but Grant, the regimental quartermaster, stayed behind to manage the camp. However, Grant wrote that his curiosity got the better of him and he went to the front lines. He wrote that shortly after arriving, a charge was ordered, and Grant joined the charge. He was one of the few that had a horse and was quickly designated to act as the adjutant of the regiment after the acting adjutant was killed. By September 23rd, the fighting had advanced into the city and was now urban house-to-house combat. But by then, the U.S. forces were bogged down and running low on ammunition. Grant volunteered to ride back and report their situation, exposing himself to the withering fire from the windows and rooftops. Grant, with his riding experience, hung off the side of his horse to avoid the gunfire and dashed through the streets to the outskirts of town, arriving safely to make his report. The Americans made another push, but within the urban confines, U.S. casualties were staggering. However, the tide turned when the more experienced Texas volunteers taught the others how to break through the walls and the roofs and fight inside the buildings. On September 24th, Generals Ampudia and Taylor negotiated a 2-month armistice. The Mexican army turned over the city to the Americans and were allowed to leave intact. Grant recalled, "My pity was aroused by the sight of the Mexican garrison, marching out of town, mounted on miserable little half-starved horses. The men looked in but little better condition." By now, General Taylor's victories had made him quite popular back in the States, and he was posing a political problem for the current administration of President Polk. Therefore, the Polk administration appointed General Winfield Scott as Supreme Military Commander of the war with Mexico. Grant wrote that Scott removed Taylor from the bulk of his command and left him only enough troops to hold the existing conquests. Grant and his 4th Infantry were then assigned to Scott's command. Grant returned to the mouth of the Rio Grande, and the troops boarded old cargo sailing ships for the month-long trip to the Veracruz region of coastal Mexico. On March 9, 1847, Scott's Army and Navy completed the first major amphibious landing in U.S. history in preparation for the siege on Veracruz. Veracruz was thought to be the strongest fortress in North America at the time of the American landing. However, turmoil in the Mexican government prevented reinforcements from arriving before the Americans. General Scott began a land and naval artillery siege of Veracruz, inflicting heavy damage, breaking down the walls, and killing hundreds, many civilians. On March 29th, the beleaguered Mexicans surrendered Veracruz and nearby positions. General Scott then made plans to move on the interior city of Mexico. Grant wrote that while Scott's army was 12,000 strong, it was not nearly large enough to march 260 miles and take Mexico City with its population of nearly 100,000. In addition, yellow fever, wounds, and a permanent garrison for Veracruz defenses left Scott's army with only 8,500 healthy men. On April 12th, Scott's forward divisions met the Mexican army at Cerro Gordo Pass. Grant describes in his memoirs that a frontal assault was impossible. Captain Robert E. Lee and his command scouted out a flanking route hidden from the enemy, and the Army engineers built crude roads to the rear of the enemy positions. But animals could not pass on these roads, so the troops manhandled the artillery pieces by hand through the steep terrain. On April 18th, the battle ensued. The Mexicans were so surprised by the flanking maneuver and their subsequent encirclement that they surrendered by 10 o'clock that morning. By now, with Taylor attacking from the north and Scott advancing in the south, the Mexican army was stretched thin and demoralized. In early May, Scott sent Grant's division, under the command of General William Worth, on to the city of Puebla. The city surrendered without a fight on May 15th. By August, reinforcements arrived and they began the march to Mexico City. Scott's army still amounted to only 10,000 men. By mid-August 1847, Scott's army engaged the Mexicans at the battles of Contreras and Churubusco, defeating the Mexicans and capturing nearly 1,500 prisoners. Of the prisoners, 72 were U.S. Army deserters. 50 of these were sentenced to hang. On September 8th, the battle for Mexico City began. Scott ordered General Worth, to whom Grant's battalion was assigned, to take Molino del Rey, a mill suspected of housing a cannon foundry. Grant wrote that he was one of the first men in and noticed Mexican troops still on top of the building, endangering American troops. Grant, along with several other troops, climbed to the roof, only to find an American private, by himself, had already captured the Mexicans. The battle was over by early afternoon. While Molino del Rey was an American victory, the losses were high and the suspected foundry proved of little value. On September 12th and 13th, the Americans attacked and took Chapultepec Castle. Soon after, Scott sent Worth's division to storm the San Cosme Gate into the city. On the approach to the gate, Grant is credited with flanking an enemy position and driving away enemy troops, endangering the advancing Americans. Grant then organized a group of soldiers who hauled a disassembled howitzer over dangerous enemy ground to the top of a nearby church steeple, which commanded a view over the gate. Upon reaching the church, Grant knocked on the door and politely asked the priest for permission to enter. The priest refused, but Grant convinced him that it was in his best interest to comply, as Grant was entering whether he consented or not. Grant and his men reassembled the howitzer and bombarded the nearby Mexican troops. Worth's men broke through the gate, and by the morning of the 14th, the American flag was hoisted over the city. For his actions at Molino del Rey, Grant was breveted first lieutenant, and at San Cosme Gate breveted to captain. In writing about his promotions, Grant commented, "My regiment lost 4 commissioned officers, all senior to me, by steamboat explosions during the war. The Mexicans were not so discriminating. They sometimes picked off my juniors." Grant wrote extensively of his own opinions of the Mexican-American War, as well as of the critics of that and the American Civil War, and in hindsight commented, "My later experience has taught me 2 lessons. First, that things are seen plainer after the events have occurred. Second, that the most confident critics are generally those who know least about the matter criticized." The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed February 2, 1848, ending the war. The treaty gave the U.S. control of Texas, established the national border along the Rio Grande River, and ceded the bulk of the current American Southwest to the U.S. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, less than half of an original offer made before the war. Impacts of the treaty were felt in both nations for decades afterwards. Along with Grant, many of the leaders on both sides of the American Civil War received training and experience in the Mexican-American War. These included leaders such as George B. McClellan, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Confederate States President Jefferson Davis. This knowledge would prove critical to formulating strategy during the American Civil War, as Grant later said in an interview with writer John Russell Young. The Mexican War made the officers of the old regular armies more or less acquainted, and when we knew the name of the general opposing, we knew enough about him to make our plans accordingly. While Grant served with distinction in the Mexican War, he was opposed to the war, later writing, "To this day, I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." Grant also considered the American Civil War as deriving from the Mexican-American War. The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times.